Welcome to the program expense form training. So today we'll be actually conducting a example or performing an example of how to fill out a program expense form. So to this end, let's get started. I'm going to prepare mine in Excel, but you may have a paper copy. If you can do it in the Excel version or through Google Documents through Sheets, I would recommend that you do that, but it's not a strict requirement. So here we have a standard program expense claim form. And as you can see, this will exactly look like your paper copy and the example copy in the in the finance training binder that you have. So in order to get started, and per a previous training session where we discussed general expectations, the first thing you would do is you would indicate on the program expense form which program this expense form is intended for. So, for example's sake, I'll say that I'm a program supervisor at Chase River, and I'm preparing this for out of school care. So here I would write Chase River out of school care. This can be bolded. Um, Now, in the as discussed previously, program expenses, the program expense form should only be prepared for receipts for 1 month, and the time frame, of course, for submitting program expense forms as well as a complete finance package to the finance department is by the 5th of the following month. So, for this example, I'll say that this is for the month of May. So here I would indicate the month of May on the program expense form. Now, hypothetically in this month I will have incurred a number of expenses, and we have some examples of receipts, and we'll talk about the general expectation or rules surrounding how to prepare this form in a second. So as I scroll down, some of the rules in order to prepare this properly have been indicated right at the bottom. Let's just cover those quickly right now. So in order to prepare this properly, what we do first is enter the date that is on the receipt under the date column. So the date of the receipt would go here. Point number two, you would have to include a brief description of the item purchased. So if it was food, art supplies, so on. That would go under the item purchased. So whatever the date is, the description of the item. Then as a third point, we have please enter the receipt total. Now, this part is very important. As indicated before, so program expense reimbursement checks should be turned into cash immediately upon receipt. What we don't want to have happen, obviously, is that money is deposited into individuals' accounts and then a debit card is used or something to that effect. That doesn't give us our proper paper trail that we need to demonstrate compliance to CRA, to the auditors, and so forth. So what we want to have happen is that the check gets cashed, and when a purchase is made with that program float cash, the total will always end with a 5 or a 0. So as such, under the receipt total, and the total that goes on the receipt, the total from the receipt, I should say, will typically end with a 0 or a 5, and that's what we want you to indicate here. If amounts are not 0 or a 5, we know that either a person is using their debit card to buy it, which we absolutely do not want to have happen, or alternatively that they've made a minor error in counting. So, or in documenting the receipt. So anyway, the receipt total should always end with a 0 or a 5 if the item is purchased in cash. And the total that goes on there is the final total. That is the total that includes taxes, discounts, and rounding. And the rounding part is important. As you know, in Canada, we've eliminated the penny. And so businesses will always round up or down. And we'll see in an example very quickly that that's not, the total at the end is not always the rounded total, and so we'll have to do a little bit of thinking and determine what that zero amount needs to be. But we'll get there in a second. The fourth thing that needs to be entered on the program expense form is the total GST. And this is indicated straight off of the receipt. It's the 5% amount. So you would indicate the receipt GST total in this column. The fifth point is that you have to indicate which program the expenses belong to. Now, in general, a single program expense form will only pertain to one program and will only pertain to 1 month. That 1 month, 1 month goes without exception. There cannot be any program expenses from previous months or different months. That will end up messing up the reconciliation, which we'll go to in a second or talk about in a second. But program expense, there are rare circumstances where a program expense might be claimed for multiple clubs. Either way, for a given receipt, you would write the date, the item purchase receipt, total GST, and then you would indicate which program the expense belongs to. Right? So in this case, for most instances, or for this purpose of this example, I will write Chase River out of school care. The next section discusses why we have this section here. Now, if a rare instance happens where I go out as a program leader of Chase River OSC and have to spend some money on, let's say, Chase River daycare, this is where I would indicate the totals. Now, as a bit of a tip, just backing up 1 second, if, for instance, I'm recording the receipts for Chase River out of school care, I would do so here for all of these line items here. But as a bit of by way of a tip to everybody, let's just say I have multiple receipts here for Chase River OSC. And then it just so happens that I have to purchase something for daycare. What I would do is skip a bunch of cells or rows, and then just start the new line item that was Chase River daycare down here. Because that'll allow you to complete your totals accurately for your program, and then for whatever you have to spend on an additional program. But where you do the totaling is down here. So Chase River OSC would be entered in here. The receipt total would be the receipt total of whatever I spent for Chase River OSC, and then the total GST would be the total for the OSC program. Then I would have to do the very same thing for whatever I spent on Chase River daycare, as the example goes. So that's what point 6 is trying to indicate. And then point 7 is what we are looking for is that all receipts are attached to the program expense form, and that one staple holds them together in the upper left-hand corner of the form, and the receipts go behind the program expense form itself. So please adhere to this. Staple it in the top left corner. Don't put it all over the place, and put the program expense sheet in front of the receipts. If you happen to have too many receipts, feel free to use an envelope, but staple that behind the sheet itself, the program expense sheet, in the upper left hand corner behind the form. Okay, so why don't we go through this by way of example? So we'll start out with one quick receipt here. So this is from the city of Nanaimo. It relates to admissions for swimming. The total amount of cash I tendered to the organization was $100. The total change I received was $52.40, and so from that, you can work backwards and determine the total, or you can read the total right off here. So the total in this case is $47.60, and it was purchased on May 22. So here's my first receipt. What I would do is I would go to the top here. Let's just clear this section out. Okay. And I'll write 22 May 2015 here. We said earlier that the item purchased was a rec pass for swimming, so I would write rec pass. Okay, and then we look at the total, and it's $47.60. not the subtotal, but the total that's including GST. So here's the subtotal, they add GST to it, and now we have the 4760. That's our grand total. And we know it makes sense because it ends with a 0. I paid with cash. I paid with cash of 100. And then the change I received also ended with a 0. So the math works. So 4760 is what I would enter. Then my GST is 2.27. Now notice that the GST is not rounded, and that's perfectly fine. We can claim the full amount of GST. So we would write 2.27 here to claim, on the program expense form to claim the GST. Now the program in this case is Chase River LLC. So that completes my first receipt, and this process is repeated over and over again for as many receipts as you have. So nothing terribly complicated about this. But let's, for the sake of example, go through a couple of more receipts. So the second receipt that I'm going to look at is this Rona Home and Garden receipt, and it looks like what I spent was so I tendered $10 of cash. They rounded. They had to do some rounding for the purpose of the elimination of the penny. And the total change I got back was 205. So we can figure it out backwards, or we can look at the total. Now here you'll notice that the total is, it looks like 794. So that's not the total that we're looking for. We're looking for the rounded total because we spent with cash. So this is the final total on the receipt. So I would not enter 5.94. I would enter, or sorry, 7.94. I would enter 7.95 as the total expenditure. So let's go back to the program expenses. So, and sorry, the date of this looks like is the 4th of May down here. So let's enter for May 2015. Now, it looks like I purchased on this day some bulk piping, some insulation. So bulk piping. And the total amount, again, was the 7.95, not the 7.94. So 7.95. And then the GST amount, straight off the receipt, not the PST, just the GST. It looks like in this case is 0.38. Again, say this is for Chase River out of school care. Okay, so the last receipt that we have here, it looks like is from Walmart, and it was for the purchase of a gazebo. So the date that I purchased this item, it looks like, is the 20th of May, so that's indicated down here. 20th May 2015. And the gazebo is what I purchased. Okay. And now on this total, here's an interesting example. So on the total, what they have indicated is 197.12. Now, per the previous example, we know that that is not the amount that I want to record because, again, I paid in cash, as indicated in the cash tender, 200. There's no longer any penny, and the change that was due to me was 290. So again, we can work backwards to identify what the correct amount is. In this case, when I subtract 290 from 200, I get 197.10, not 197.12. So the correct amount that I need to record for my gazebo purchase is 197.10. Again, that's the rounded number, that's the rounded total, the total that we're looking for. Okay, and then next I would pull out the GST, so it's 880, and the GST is at 5%, so 880. And once again, Chase River out of school care. Now at the bottom here, what I would do is I would total the columns up. So I could go, in this case it's pretty easy for me because I'm using Excel. You might have to use a calculator to do this. But you want to be able to get the total for the total expenditures made and the total amount of GST. Okay, so the next step here is, before we get into the next step, by way of example, why don't we say turns out that I had to buy something for Chase River Daycare. Right? So in this case, let's say that the gazebo is for Chase River Daycare and not for Chase River Out of School Care. Per the tip that I gave before, just record this a little bit lower so that it's clearly distinct from the rest of the program expenses for Chase River Out of School Care. If that was the case, then I would go down to the program, as I've indicated. So here I would write program Chase River Daycare. The receipt total per the Chase River Daycare program in this case is 197. I would write 197 there. And then I would pick up the GST for the Chase River Daycare portion of the expense. For instances where there's no split, don't worry about filling this out. But in this case, for example's sake, we're creating a two-program representation. In general, we don't want that to happen. Again, this is an exception case, just for example, for the sake of example. So the next thing we would write is Chase River Out of School Care. And we would have to go and sum the totals for Chase River Out of School Care. So in this case, it's this cell plus this cell, or the 47.6 plus the 795. That would get us the total for the Chase River Out of School Care. And we would record the GST total as well. So the GST total, of course, is just the sum of these two, and that's 265. So we would record 265 down here. So we can do a quick check in Excel. You should check your math if you're doing a split program as well. The total claim we know is 252.65. We have 252.65 for these two items, so we know we're good on that front. And when we add these two up, we know that that total equals the total that we totaled earlier from the total GST of the program. So the next step is to write down your total claim. So all you would write is the total claim per your what's being actually the total amount of cash used per all the receipts you have. So you'd write your total claim there, and then likewise you would write your total GST being claimed here. Now there are instances where an item might be purchased where there's no receipt provided. In that case, what you do is you have to document on the form that you purchased something and that no receipt was provided. So hypothetically, let's say I didn't buy a gazebo. Let's say I went to a swimming center and they don't offer receipts for me. Here I would have to write something like swimming center passes, and then most importantly, no receipts provided. Okay. So when there's an instance of no receipts, don't just do nothing. Document in detail what you did. So swimming center passes, no receipts provided, went swimming on whatever date, right? So May 20th can be your example here. So went swimming on May 20th, or May 20th with 30 kids or something like that. That would be sufficient for my purposes, for the finance department purposes, for documentation. You wouldn't need to justify it any further than that. So that's in the case where you, again, don't have a receipt. Generally speaking, a receipt will be provided to you, and so you must obtain that receipt. Another thing to note is that debit receipts, so if you don't cash the check properly, and if you're using your debit card, a debit card receipt is not sufficient. It actually has to be the original receipt indicating what the GST amount is. And the whole reason why we do this is because the organization actually receives a GST refund. So every time, but you can only claim that refund if a receipt exists, right? You have to have original receipts per CRA. So when we don't claim it, the organization ends up losing money. So we ask that everybody obtain receipts for the items that they've purchased with cash. This is why we emphasize it so much. It translates to a significant refund that we can reallocate towards the programs. So at this point, I've completed my program expense form. I've had a few anomaly situations with daycare, the split, and again, for this example, I'm trying to give you what I can think of that might come up. That's an abnormal situation. Generally speaking, again, one program expense claim form, 1 month, one program. So at this point, I'm done this component of it, and I would then hand my program expense claim form and the rest of the finance package per a separate, well, as discussed in a previous training session. I would hand my whole package together to my supervisor, and that's the date that I would record here. So in this case, let's assume that I'm an area coordinator. And that I handed my program expenses for the Chase River Out of School Care to the Director of Operations. And let's say that I handed it in on June 2nd. Right? So here I would write June 2nd, 2015. And I would write my name. I would write my name here as the claimant. And then I would put down my signature. In case I don't have the electronic signature available, so I'll just write signature, but I would sign off on this. And then my supervisor, so in this case, if hypothetically I'm an area coordinator, it would be the director of operations who signs off on me, signs off on this form. If it's the if I was a LPS or program leader, then it would be the area coordinator who would sign off on this form. Okay, so this at this point we are not quite finished yet. The very important part of this process still has to be completed. In fact, from the finance department standpoint, one of the most important parts of it, and that's the reconciliation, the bank reconciliation that has to be performed each month without exception. Any program expense form that isn't complete with a reconciliation will be returned to the person preparing it, and chances are that individual will have to re-watch this training video just to refresh their memory on what needs to be performed. So on the back of your program expense form each month, you have to conduct a reconciliation. There's nothing complicated about this reconciliation. It's a plus B equals C kind of scenario, but it's very important to understand what is going on here so that this can be done correctly. So A, cash and save. Okay, so the cash and save, the cash count has to be performed each month at month's end by somebody from your program other than the person preparing it. Right, so somebody other than me would go in, count up all the cash in the float left over at month's end before anything else is purchased, right? So at this point, we're saying that as of May 31st, all of my program expenses have been spent, that this is the total amount that I'm claiming, and so the cash left over should equal my float. So somebody other than me would go in, count all the cash in the safe, and write down what the amount is in the safe, and then sign the back of the form, right? So somebody other than myself, or in your case, if you're preparing the form, somebody other than you. So cash and safe. Next part is the total claim. So the total claim is precisely the amount that I'm actually claiming on the form, the rounded amount, assuming that I have not used any, the total which only consists of zeros and fives as an ending balance, assuming that I have converted all of my float reimbursement or float total check into cash. And then you would simply add these two amounts together. Now, this in and of itself is not enough, right? So when reviewing some of the program expenses, some individuals have thought, okay, well, this is all I need to do. That's actually incorrect. And in this example, there's actually a serious problem. And so we'll talk about what that is. Basically, the whole purpose in performing a reconciliation is to ensure that your float that you have signed off on with an agreement with the finance department equals the float that you're allowed to have. So per the, now this is a document that's included in everyone's finance training package and can be obtained from the finance department at any time if you're missing your copy. But basically this document, the program spending limits, indicates how much cash you're supposed to have in your float. So in this case, Chase River Out of School Care should have a float, cash float, of $400. They're also allowed to have a food limit of $400 from Country Grocer. That was covered in a separate training module, so that the total amount that they could spend in a given month is $800. But for the purpose of program expenses, they're supposed to have $400 in cash. So when we go back to this reconciliation, we know that their float needs to be $400, not $392. So now there's a difference. The difference is $7.35. And the obvious question that the finance department would ask now is, what happened to the $7.35? $7.35 in and of itself isn't a big amount, but we still want to know what happened. What part of this process wasn't followed properly? But you can imagine if it was, let's say the cash in the safe signed off by another staff member was $40, and the difference was 107. Now we would have a big problem. We would start to think perhaps it was the safe was broken into and that cash was stolen. You can imagine what the problems are there, but obviously that would suggest something very wrong has happened. Perhaps theft has occurred. Who knows? Money is being misplaced. But bottom line, we would know that the proper procedures were not followed. So in general, at month's end, your cash in safe counted by somebody else should precisely equal the difference between what your allowed cash float is and your total claim. So in this case, let's assume that that occurred, and that my cash in safe is $147.35, and some other staff member other than me has signed off on it. Now, one way we know to ensure one thing I can speak to is that we know when a count has not been performed accurately when, let's say, some rounding. So if I mistakenly wrote here 172 per that receipt we looked at before, if this number plus, so if I mistakenly write this down, and then when it's reviewed by finance department, so I mistakenly write that down, and the total I'm claiming is this, 252.67. And then I do my reconciliation, and I'm 2 cents out now, right? So the difference between what I should have in my cash float and what my actual cash float is there's a difference of 2 cents. We can basically tell that somebody hasn't been performing a cash count because you shouldn't be 2 cents out. It should always agree, right? So when an error, like if your program expense form hasn't been prepared according to this set of instructions here, we'll basically be able to know if a reconciliation hasn't been prepared properly, i.e. somebody hasn't counted the cash. But the expectation is that at month end, there's always a cash count. That is a non-negotiable, has to happen. So anyway, going back to this, we'll just assume that it was prepared properly and that there's no difference. So again, the whole point of the reconciliation is for us to be able to tell very quickly if the proper procedures have been followed. So it's simply cash and safe counted properly by a staff member at month end, the total claim. That number should then equal the allotted cash float number per the program expense form. These numbers are set by our budgets, and in turn those budgets are approved by our board. So this goes to the highest level of the organization. So it behooves us to make sure that this is done properly. So that it essentially completes how to prepare a program expense form.